Here in section 15, we're going to be talking about key EAR definitions. Much like we saw in ITAR, it's really difficult to talk in detail about the Export Administration regulations without first going through a rather exhaustive exercise of providing specific definitions. As we see in the first bullet point, not unlike the ITAR, export regs, the EAR, use terms and acronyms that are unique to its realm of export compliance. As we said a moment ago, without a clear understanding of the EAR specific meaning of these terms, proper adherence to the regs is very, very difficult. As a best practice, and our final bullet point on this slide, for the proper interpretation of terms used in the EAR, rely on Part 772, aptly entitled Definition of Terms. That's where the terminology comes from that we're going to be presenting you right now. Now, we try to keep this as alphabetical as possible, but there are just certain things that have to be said first in order for the rest of the material to make sense. So we're going to start off with an important term that I've already used a number of times, item. An item is any commodity, technology, or software that is subject to the EAR. There's that terminology we just learned in our previous section. A commodity, on the other hand, is any article, material, or supply except technology and software, intangibles in essence. As a best practice, when working with the ITAR and EAR, be sure to use the proper terminology. You'll remember from our ITAR discussion that a defense article, the term article, is specific to ITAR. Here in the EAR, we're going to be using the term item. So there are specific terms to different regulations. Now we're getting into the thick of things. The Commerce Control List, the CCL, that we mentioned briefly before. It's a list of items under the export control jurisdiction of BIS, and that's found in supplement number 1 to Part 774. So it's a list of product descriptions, item descriptions that come under the export control jurisdiction of BIS. We're going to show you what that looks like in just one moment. But in our sub-bullet points, you'll see that we're talking about a list of items with licensing requirements and possible exceptions. They're also a list of controlled items that are designated, and here's another new term that we'll be defining in a moment. Don't worry about it just yet, but by an export control classification number. You're going to hear this over and over again, an ECCN, an export control classification number. The CCL, the Commerce Control List, is divided into 10 broad categories with 5 product groups. We actually mentioned that briefly when we showed the screenshot of the Export Administration regulations. We'll be talking about it in greater detail in just a few moments. Now, as a trade tip, and this is especially significant, the alphabetical index to the CCL, it's a good place to begin the classification process, because really what we're talking about here when we break out the Commerce Control List is helping to determine if our product is subject to the EAR, and if so, is it subject to any license authorization requirements, an actual export license, a license exception, or an NLR status, no license required. But the alphabetical index is really one of the first steps in making those determinations. And like any index, we're going to go to it and using a product description, an item description of ours as an exporter, search out that product in the alphabetical index and begin the classification process. The classification process of determining what type of license authorization is required from BIS. Let's have a look at a more visual representation of what we're talking about. So as an export perspective, we're showing you an excerpt of the Commerce Control List Index. You'll note that it is found in supplement number 4 to Part 774. And as the name would indicate, it is indeed an alphabetical index of products. We picked the letter A just to get things rolling. We have a series of examples that will continue to illustrate these points that we're bringing up. But let's focus down on acoustic systems of a marine nature to be used in water. And you'll notice to the right of that, an alphanumeric series 6A001.A. We will elaborate on what that means, again, as an ECCN citation, the Export Control Classification Number. So the beginning of a classification process, the beginning, because there are many steps or a good place to start, is by using that alphabetical index. And if we happen to make or sell overseas acoustic systems that can be used in a marine environment, we have some work to do because it shows up on the index. Let's move on. Continuing on our export perspective, we're looking at an actual Commerce Control List entry. Previously, we were looking at the index, an alphabetical index. Now we're looking at an actual entry, and the nomenclature of the CCL is the same. The content will be different by entry, by item description, but how it's laid out, its nomenclature, is the same. And we're actually looking at, as we previously saw, the ECCN, the Export Control Classification Number, for 6A001. It was actually 6A001.A. We'll get to that in just a moment. But when you go from the index to the actual entry, the corresponding entry for the example that we're using now, this is it. You'll note the description, acoustic systems, equipment, components as follows. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail here because we're just lining up our definitions, but it's worth mentioning a couple of points as it relates to the layout of an entry. You'll notice right below license requirements, it says reasons for control. Remember we talked about that? The multiple reasons why a given item could be controlled? Well, here it shows NS and AT. It could be different for different entries, but in this particular case, it's for national security and anti-terror reasons. So this particular item that fits these technological parameters that we'll talk about in a moment are being controlled for reasons of national security and anti-terror. Going further down, you'll notice things like list-based license exceptions. We have multiple slides on license exceptions, so it's really not appropriate to go into detail on license exceptions now, but these are the list of exceptions under specific conditions that can be used in place of having to get an actual export license. Again, we're going to go through those in some detail, but for purposes of getting accustomed to how the entries are laid out, it's important to mention that. From there, we'll point out before moving on, list of items controlled. These are the specific technological parameters. And we'll finish up by saying that 6A001.A is listed right there. Marine acoustic systems, equipment, and specially designed components thereof as follows. So it goes into even more detail. There are actually other pages to this entry, but of course, we're just introducing the terminology, so we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but a good intro to what we'll be looking at in much greater detail. Another key definition, the Commerce Country Chart, also known as the Country Chart. It's a matrix, and we'll show it in just one second, that is used to determine if a license is required for an item based on its destination and reason for control. So again, this theme of end use and end user. It's really based on this principle known as an X in the box. And you'll understand why we say that in just one second. But if there's an X in the box for a specific country, for a specific reason for control, we as an exporter are going to have to continue through the process to make a determination if we actually need a license or if there's an exception, whatever the case might require. The Commerce Country Chart, last bullet point, is found in Part 738, Supplement Number 1. Let's wrap up Section 15 by having a look at that. So this is an excerpt from the Commerce Country Chart. Focus on the name, the Country Chart. So this is the destination-specific component of export controls under the EAR. This is just an excerpt, but it's listed alphabetically. We happen to pick the letter B, but you'll notice across the top, reasons for control, chemical and biological weapons, nuclear nonproliferation, national security, on and on across the board. Now, if we have a specific item that has an ECCN and we know what country it's going to, we have to use this matrix to match up the requirement. So you'll note, let's pick the very first country in our letter B, it's Bahrain. Lots of X's across the board. If there's an X in the box, there's an authorization requirement in place. You'll notice, for example, just to provide a little bit of contrast here, the country of Belgium. Fewer X's in the box. There's no coincidence that Belgium is an important ally of ours in Europe, and one that we share many common values and approaches to export control. So there are going to be fewer X's in the box than compared to a country like Botswana, where we don't have the same relationship or the same level of shared controls as we do with Belgium. Now, we're not here to single out any one country, but it's worth pointing out for illustrative purposes that it is likely, depending on the nature of the item, not always, but likely that our allies, Western Europe as an example, there are others, are going to find fewer X's in the box than countries that we are not as close to from an allied perspective. But the point is this: we have to use the CCL, the Commerce Control List, and the Commerce Country Chart to make distinctions about the level of authorization that we need based on the nature of the product, where it's going, its end use, its end user. More on that as we move forward. This will wrap up section 15, and we'll pick up in a moment with further definitions.